but very much guide on the book. I had a draft, and I think I sort of wanted to follow this. If I want to be technical, you can call it, it is feminist epidemiology, or almost like, the way feminists think about writing, which is you place yourself at the center of the text, but then the text is not about you. But you have to be honest about where you are relative to the privileges and position of the people you are writing about. I hate this kind of writing where it's, someone from the outside writing about somebody who's very socially distant from them, as if they are like some object for analysis and you are just absent, right? And, feminists have always written in a way which moves away from that paradigm. And I wanted to do that. And I realized the best way to do it was to bring my own stories, interweave them with the data and the stories of others. But the thing, Parama, with that is the book is not about, you need to know the narrator, but the book is not about me. The book is about all these other women I followed for 15 years. And I think on the bit about Shah Rukh and love, while you're right, I think love plays sort of two roles in the book. One is, of course, he's South Asia's romantic superhero. He still continues to be. What's fascinating about that is that I measured the amount of time women speak in his films relative to the amount of time women speak in other big contemporary hits or even the biggest hits of cinema. And you find that women just speak far more in his films. They have more to say. They may be soppy, candy floss films, but they're speaking. And there's this constant depiction of engagement, right? So here's a man, I interviewed Anupama Chopra for the book, and she said to me, we'd never seen masculinity like this, because here's a man who's racing helicopters 1 minute, and the next minute he's helping you pick out saris, right? So there's that imagery, which is just where there's a man doing emotional labor, domestic labor, a very different masculine, which really appealed, I think, to so many of the women I was speaking to. The fact that he's in the kitchen, a mother of a fan I interviewed said to me, I'd never seen a man cut vegetables unless he was playing a cook in a film. But he did that in DDLJ. He's constantly doing domestic labor. And in a country where we are in the bottom 5 in the world when it comes to men helping in the house with housework, is it really that surprising? It almost sets up the demand and supply of this icon, right? So that's one. So I think there's a kind of love that he portrays. But there's another way I think love comes up in his iconography and in the book, because the book is not about him. The book is about the lives of all these women. And in a way, what binds them together are two things. One, their love for him. But the second is their love for their own independence. They want to be economically independent. They want to have a house of their own. They want an income of their own. And in a country which is now reporting, again, bottom 5 when it comes to women's economic freedoms in the world, our female employment rate has dramatically dropped. It is one of the lowest in the world, and yet it's not a political issue. I don't hear anyone getting upset about it. I think people like it, that women should just stay at home. 70% of women between the ages of 26 to 34 are essentially doing work, but doing work at home, domestic work, and it's unpaid and unrecognized. Now, in this landscape, and we know public space is not free and easy for women, corporate practices still, you'll know this, it's difficult for women to move up. It's difficult for women to hold space, to have money. Given all of that, all these women are trying to be economically their own person. They want to, just actuate their own desires. They want the money to watch an actor they want to watch. And what you realize through all the stories in the book is there's so much emotional, I call it an emotional tax. Economists call it a hidden tax, that lovers, boyfriends, fathers, mothers keep imposing on these women just because they're deviating from that very standard script of what a woman is supposed to be. These women are not interested in being mothers or wives. They want to do different things. And I think the love that Shah Rukh actually provides these women is kind of escape and relief from these hidden taxes, because there's the story of the accountant in the book, and she actually says that each time I feel disappointed, I actually just listen to one of his interviews, because he'll say something wise or helpful or funny, and she feels lighter. So I think it's both kinds of love, where we live in a society which doesn't love women, and so seeing a man that loves women, that has an immediate psychological connect. I think, those wide open arms may seem silly to a lot of people, but you realize through the book that there's like a very strong psychological role that they're playing. And it is because of this hidden tax. It is because of the economy, because the economy and society make it so hard for women to even love themselves, you know, to just do what they want to do. And I think he's relief and he's comfort in that.
It's so true because, you know, in one of the large multinationals I worked for, an American company, very well known, we had Shah Rukh over for a function. And I remember the kind of hysteria he caused in women. And these are young, educated women working for a very prestigious company. We had to cordon off the stage. And they would just be rushing towards him. And he's so professional. He asked a couple of us who were organizing that, so you want me to call up only women or a mix of men and women? And will you pick out the women or can I pick? And, you know, and how do you want it? And he was like pitch perfect. I said, no, call some of the boys because it'll otherwise be really, you know, discriminatory. And he said, no, anything that you want me to do. And he talked to them, he danced with them. Somebody in excitement fell at his feet.
I have this horrible feeling this might be me at some point, and I hope not.
And we were horrified. And he picked her up, patted her on the head, fed her some water, and said, come, I'll do a dance with you. I said, can you just play this music? I'll do a little dance. So this man is truly amazing. I mean, and he can just switch. So do you also think, this is my question actually, that he's a really consummate actor, of course, a performer, who can switch his tune or just note, but at the same time, I felt somewhere at his core, he's deeply, you know, he has a well of empathy.
I can't, I mean, I wish I knew him well enough to say all these. I mean, yes, I think there's a kind of icon. What I can say, based on what the women I followed would tell me, is I think a couple of things. You know, who are our big icons? I mean, let's look at our politics right now, or let's look at popular culture, or even cricket, right? Our big icons are these stoic, strong men. We have a crisis of masculinity. It's not just happening in India, it's happening globally. You have men who want to shout at each other and want to shout at women, be it on Twitter, be it anywhere else. And I think given this really wounded, angry, you know, what I call ground reality uncle type masculinity, is it really that surprising that someone who then portrays themselves so differently and works hard to portray themselves so differently, and you know, many of the women in the book would say to me, and these are intelligent people, they would say, maybe it's an act, we don't know, but we appreciate the act because who else is acting like this in our culture? And I do want to say this is, you know, you want to call it a performance, it's real, I mean, I'm not going to say anything, I think it's very much real as a fan, but it's been something that he's been doing even before words like feminism became trendy in our culture. I mean, I remember in the 1990s, a young woman, she's a domestic worker who I follow for 10 years in the book, Adivasi woman who's moved from Jharkhand, works for a very rich expat in a very posh neighborhood in Delhi. She said to me that, oh, did you know that he wanted to make toilets for women? Why is she saying that? She's saying that because she actually works in a sector where women are not allowed to use sanitation facilities of the employers very often. That's number one. Number two, she said to me, oh, have you seen in that film Rab Ne Bana Di Jodi, which, by the way, everyone should watch if you haven't seen it. It's fabulous. There's a scene where he has a tiffin that his wife has made for him, and he's serenading the tiffin. It looks ridiculous to a more westernized, rational sensibility. But this young girl who's working 24 hours a day, barely with any time to herself, says to me, oh, and working in domestic work, she's doing care labor, says, oh, if all men appreciated, and I quote this in the book, if all men appreciated the tiffin that their wives made the way he does in that song, women's lives would be so much better. And so there are these connections that people who may not have, you know, massive amounts of education, they've certainly not studied film theory, any of that, but they're making these connections. They're seeing these idioms and they resonate with them. And Parama, one thing I'm really trying to argue in the book, I think it's a failure of perhaps celebrity journalism, because this book is not about a celebrity, it's a book of economics. But one of the things that I think celebrity journalism tends to do is place the celebrity at such a high pedestal, and this idea that this person is like one monolith person, and all of us are consumers, right? So there's one version of a Salman, or there's one version of a Shah Rukh, and all of us are just consuming. When you read the book, what you actually realize is all of the women are co-creating him, and they create a version of him, picking and choosing bits of songs, images, whatever their incomes and status allows them to have access to, because many of the poorer women in the book have never even been able to watch a full film of his. They are creating their own Shah Rukh, and I actually write this in the book, that his extraordinary icon is completely built on the ordinary frustrations and everyday experiences of all these women. And so I think we should retire this idea that, there's this one standard version. I think there are different versions of Mr. Shah Rukh Khan that these women have created. And you would have noticed in the book, I always call him Shah Rukh in the book, and I don't know him, but on public platform I call him Mr. Khan because I don't know him as a person. But that's because each of the women in the book has created their own version of Shah Rukh, and he feels real to them. And so I think, to answer your question, empathy, I think they see it that way because that's an idiom they've created. And I often felt, listening to the stories, and now that I take a step back, it's been 15 years of conversations, I realized that perhaps the reason they're seeing empathy in him, because of the roles he chooses, the way he speaks, even in the interviews, that's very important, is because there's such a lack of empathy in their real lives. You see the stories. I mean, just the way women are, the gaze towards women is so harsh. The self-scrutiny is so harsh. So I think that's why they like the loving gaze. It's sort of open and embracing.
Yes, and I also think that there is a sense of self-deprecation and humor in Shah Rukh that really appeals to people. Yeah. Because if some of you know the Pakistani writer Muhammad Hanif, who is very, very well known in the subcontinent, and somebody called him the Shah Rukh Khan of literature. and he said that, well, only in the subcontinent, short, aging, middle-aged men are called sex symbols, and myself included. And somebody actually repeated this to Shah Rukh, I heard, in one platform. But he said, he's absolutely right. I mean, I can't fathom this myself. But we are just around, I think. And so I think, because you're right, I mean, even in Bollywood, as well as, in our everyday lives, we tend to deify people so much, whether it's a cricketer, whether it's a film star, or any other celebrity, to have human elements like this. Make him endearing, make him understandable, and make him enduring in some ways, because he's really not your monolithic person. At least he does not come across like that. If it's cultivated, it's very smart. But I don't think, and he's a very smart man. I mean, everyone says that.
You know a lot more.
Yeah, I mean, just business dealings. He's an extremely smart man. But what is interesting is his appeal to women. I think it's a whole, sort of mix of all these things, what you're saying. And maybe it took an economist to point that out.
Yeah, no, a couple of things, right? One, I think, in fact, what I want to say is, if you look at the women in the book, to each one, he's different. So in particular for women who are the first in their families to study, there's an entire section of stories of women who are the first women in their families to ever dare to dream to have a job, and they have a job. And it's really difficult because this tyranny of marriage, I mean, these are typically women living in the north, coming from mercantile caste families, first generation of the middle class. The economy has opened up, and suddenly, they have more access to media, and their aspirations have sort of grown. They want a job. It is so difficult because the families only want them to marry, and there's a woman in the book who ends up working in the government in a very prestigious job. And she's constantly being told by her family that, well, it's great you did well in the civil service exams, but what about the marriage exams? And she called them the marriage exams. She said, I don't want to be taking the marriage exams. And I think in that time, she used to watch his interviews, and she had a little scrapbook where she'd keep like notes of things he would say, not film songs or any of that. It was just imagery from the interviews. And I think this is what we forget when we think about him, is that he was the first celebrity who had access to this satellite boom, because he is our first post-liberalization superstar. Suddenly there were more television channels. Suddenly there was Delhi Times. There were all these new dailies that reported so much information. He was great content. The media needed that kind of partnership. He was the first celebrity who made themselves accessible, and also that accessibility meant that I could come home in the afternoon, switch on the TV, and he would be on television talking about life, careers, chain smoking. And so many of the middle-class women I spoke to, they said to me the word middle class entered their dictionary because they'd watch him constantly calling himself middle class. And then they asked people like, well, what does that mean? And these are women who probably wouldn't have followed Manmohan Singh's budget speech, or they wouldn't know the economy had moved. But he signaled these shifts. And I think it was the humor and it was the lackadaisical way. But the other thing I have to say, Paroma, which is I think where the economy again comes into his icon. One is, of course, he is a liberalization hero, and I think he captures all the aspirations that liberalization unleashed. But sadly, I also think he captures, and it's something I'm not trying to hit the reader on the head with in the book, but you know it's there, is that he's, after all, a man who captured all the gains of liberalization. If you look at the data in the book, we know in the top 10 fastest growing sectors in the economy, women only have had less than 19% of jobs in them. 19. So you and I are part of like one of the tiniest minorities actually in the country. And he is a man who is part of the other, like the dominant part that gained. And yet it's interesting, right, that all these women who are struggling to want to exploit the gains of the economic boom, they look to him. As you know, they are not looking to female actresses, they're not looking to CEOs or sportswomen. I think that's changed now. But back then, particularly from the 90s till around the late 2000s, they were looking at him, and now, you know, that's sort of set in stone. And the interesting thing to me about that is also the fact that a very striking part of that is social mobility. We live in a country where the elite calls itself the middle class, and I have data on this in the book. But actually the elite, I mean, is small, it's not the middle class. And yet even in the elite, actually the inequality within the elites has grown many folds. And in fact, so many of the women who are sort of, you know, upper caste, privileged, they would say, well, I like him because he made it without any networks. Which is really interesting, right? Because actually relative to the ordinary person in India, he is actually quite privileged, even when he was in Delhi, because all of us, by virtue of living in a city with a certain education, are very privileged relative to the average of the country. And yet, so many of the women would connect with this idea that he didn't know any people, he worked hard, he made it on his own. And there's a full chapter of a IIT engineer she's a Tambram girl who I follow. The first chapter, her name's Vidya, she's in the book. She, you know, has all the best education, but she comes from the salaried classes and not the propertied classes. And she keeps complaining. She has a frenemyship with this other girl who's not a Shah Rukh fan. And she actually says, oh, see, this is why, if you like Shah Rukh, you usually come from a background where you've had to struggle or hustle to make it. And I think this idea of making it and what that means is something that he really seems to symbolize for a lot of women who are dealing with some significant odds in the economy. I mean, the economy is not set up for women. It does not want, I mean, the way the Indian economy works, it does not want women to participate, to be honest. Markets don't like women, particularly single women. And so they're seeing this man, and in him, he's almost part self-help guru, part weirdly politician in a strange way. I don't think he's just a film star to any of them.
Not at all. I mean, and it's a fact that he did not come from privileged film families. Whatever, I mean, he had no Bollywood lineage. He might have been privileged by our notion of privilege, but he was not really privileged in Bollywood, and he's there for 25 years. And wherever he is, and that's a huge credit to him. But paradoxically, I think this also sort of works, I mean, it's a double-edged sword for Shah Rukh. The fact that he's been completely silent on the Islamophobia which is going around, also a very unfortunate incident happened with his son, and he has been completely quiet. So, you know, from his standard fan base, I also, which includes people like me, I'm also really a Shah Rukh fan. there's a sense of disappointment with him, that why didn't he speak out, and why didn't he do more for the cause of Indian Muslims or parents, or there is a strand like that, and there is also a strand saying that what else he could have done. I mean, he is a public figure, he has to stay in this country, etc. So I found that quite interesting. In a way, I think people expect much more from him than a standard Bollywood star. What do you say to that? Men and women alike.
Yeah, I have a line in the book which says that I think he unites so many women, at least in the country, in joy, anger, and anger's parent is expectations. People are angry because they have expectations. Look, I think, in fact, I'm dying and waiting to see at what point he makes the next statement. I mean, he's such a wonderful, person to just listen to when he's being interviewed. So I won't sort of delve into that. What I will say is there's a woman I follow in the book who's a young Muslim woman, grew up in Bapu Nagar in a low-income neighborhood, which was a slum when I initially met them in 2006, and now has become an upgraded colony. I followed their stories from 2006 till 2020. And what's interesting is she loves him. The only time she mentioned religion to me was when the NRC CAA protests were happening, and she said, why is he not standing with his community?
Yeah, yeah.
But it took her, Paroma, and I write about this in the book, it took her 2 minutes to then say, well, maybe he's doing something and it's not out loud in the public.
I read that part.
And she said something which really struck me. She said, maybe this is a very difficult time for a Muslim hero to speak. And I also think, why are we just looking to him? I mean, there's a whole ecosystem in the industry, in our culture. We should look at all our icons, particularly those who don't come from minority communities, to stand up against
And
what's
nobody
happening.
is, so.
And I think, I don't think we should just put the task on just one person. But having said that, I mean, in the book I do outline that I think these expectations exist of him. And I think that is why it's strange. It's somewhat oddly political as well, partly like aspirational. And I think it can be unfair sometimes, but I also think that, as I said, right, everyone's created their own version of this Shah Rukh. And this young woman was saying to me, well, why doesn't he speak? But maybe he will speak. And then, of course, we saw what happened. But I do want to say no one in the book ever reduced him to his religion. They think he's wildly sexy. They think he's so wonderful. He's so funny. All these sort of other attributes. I have been talking to these women and their family members, 15 years, not a single person mentioned religion as an attribute. It only came up when the NRC CAA protests were happening, and that too by one person. I think while our culture may want to reduce him to, these narrow identities, I don't actually think his fan base, and actually I think there's a large population that won't do that.
Yeah, and I mean, I'll just narrate one short anecdote and then we can open it up for questions. Again, in another set of circumstances where he was doing something for us, and it was end of a long day, and he was sitting in his dressing room without makeup. He had dark circles. He still looked amazingly good. So somebody wanted a photograph of him, not with him, of him. And it was very awkward, but she was so insistent. So I went inside and asked him that I feel terrible, but somebody wants this photograph. And it was just one spot above his head. And he was looking amazing, very tired and drawn, but he said, like this? I said, yes, but you feel free to say no. He said, no, I won't. Send her in. So she came in, and he said, look, see, this is the way I look at the end of a long working day, like anyone, and I am very tired, but I'm going to do this for you. Take it, but my only request is that don't put it on a public platform, because I am required to look in a certain way for my films. And she took an amazing photograph. She was very tired and gaunt, but the real. And I mean, I was blown away by this. I mean, he could have just shooed her away, right? It wouldn't have made any difference to him or us. But he did that, and he said that. I also think that there's this grain of honesty, which, I don't think that was manufactured, because I was there. And this makes him real. Yeah, and to men and women alike, but particularly I think to women. And all the things that you say, that he in some ways embodies the struggle, the spirit, uh, the romance. So he actually plays many roles and dons many hats.
Yeah, what I do want to say is, the book is, I'll keep saying it, the book is not about, I mean, there's enough, in fact, I really want to read his book about him. I mean, that's the one I think will be the fun one to read. But the book is about what has happened to womanhood, right? And I think his is a powerful icon to teach us something about that. I mean, for example, it's interesting to me what you just said, that a young woman is standing there wanting to take this picture. I mean, if I look at it as an economist, it's interesting. Number one, she has, well, there's agency, there's income, there's freedom of movement, there's ability to actually interact in a market. When you read the book, you realize only 8% of women in the country report watching a film in a month. The percentage for men is much higher. OTT, we live in this bubble where we seem to believe everybody's watching OTT, barely anyone is. It's a really small group. And you know this, you work in the field and you have a sense of the data. It's really small and it's in the book. But what's fascinating to me is that, we tend to think of fandom as, oh, just a social thing. She's standing there wanting to take a picture. But fandom is an economic activity. Fandom means you need to have money to be able to go and watch a film, to follow the work of an artist. You need access to cinema halls. Cinema halls are really unsafe. India has one of the highest gaps when it comes to mobile phone access for women.
Yes,
so the fact that she even has a mobile phone to take a picture, right? Like, look at these different traits and recognize, if you stake back, that the market, actually, the thing that she's doing is such an anomaly. Because for most women, it's very difficult to do. So when I say in the book that they're desperately seeking Shah Rukh, I don't think they're seeking just the photo. I think it's the freedom to want to actuate whatever gives you joy, right? Like whatever gives you pleasure. That picture gives her pleasure. It's very hard to do. And the stories in the book tell you why the economy has just been set up in a way where women will not be able to access and claim their joy. It's just not what I think the institutions of our society are set up to do. And I think that's why he becomes more powerful, because the more restricted it is, the harder, the more you enjoy it. And the one last thing I will say, Parama, which is fascinating to me actually as I thought about the book, and it's in the book, for women from conservative families in particular, when they start to say that they like an actor, it makes, as you see in the story in the book, the men are very uncomfortable, fathers are uncomfortable, brothers are uncomfortable. Girls are not allowed to take the snippets and posters with them where they're going. They're supposed to hide them. It's because we live in a country, because of caste, we are frightened of female sexuality. We're so scared of what will happen when women start to own their bodies and do what they want to do with them. And suddenly when someone is saying, oh, I enjoy watching an actor, what are you saying? You're saying you think this man is attractive. You're hinting at your own sexual preferences. And in a country where women's sexuality is supposed to be hidden under shame, under these scripts of a certain kind of womanhood and behavior, being silly, wanting a photo, thinking someone's attractive, talking about that, gushing, all of that makes people so uncomfortable. And it is because we have a contract where we've told a lot of women, you need to hide your preferences, ideally submit to an arranged marriage, which is universal in this country. It's the majority route where people are marrying. And I think it's interesting, fandom is almost like a strange form of resistance, because it's a lot of these women saying, I want to own my sexuality and I want to talk about who I think is attractive, and I think that's totally fine. And I think that signals a very important shift in our society for women. And I think we have a bunch of men and also women, older women, who in these families, at least the stories I tell, are very frightened of this. They're very scared of what that will lead to. And I think that's a really interesting, so that story you told was beautiful, but if I look at it from the aspect of the market and the economy and women's freedom, economic freedom, freedom to just do what they want, it's actually quite remarkable that she's been able to do what she did.
Yeah, and what is remarkable was that she just wanted to take his picture. She didn't want to pose with him. That was very significant. And to your point about men being uncomfortable, all my male colleagues who were very privileged and working in the same multinational said, you deal with this. We cannot deal with this hysterical women. Please, please deal with this. So it was really funny. So with that, we would really like to open it up to a few questions if you have any. This gentleman at the back.
So thank you for this very insightful session. So I had a twofold question. The first is that when you were interacting with these women, I wanted to know about the men of these households. Like, did they have any, like, what was their view of Shah Rukh as a person? And whether they also had an attractive appeal to this person? Because maybe we are restricting it to a very heterosexual male, appeal of such an icon. So that is one question. The second is, did they notice any change of the women of their household in the kind of gender roles that they were expected to play? So, like, when they are seeing Shah Rukh cutting vegetables in DDLJ, so did the women even converse with them one day that, like even in a passing reference that, maybe you could help me out in the kitchen? So I wanted to know that from the men's perspective, like how did these women approach them or even like maybe take up this conversation with them? Thank you.
We can just go one by one. Thank you. That's a terrific question. The first line of the book is "My life has always been heteronormative hell." And so, in fact, one of the themes that's running through the book is this sort of heterosexual mating game, right? And I actually have a line there saying all of us are trapped by a certain kind of mating market and what that sort of implies. I didn't feel I had the position to write about how actually a lot of people who reject these sort of binaries view him, and I think he has a huge fan following in LGBTQ communities, and I'm really hoping someone will write that piece, but it won't be me. Men did tell me a lot about the men in the women's families. I noticed everywhere I met a female Shah Rukh fan, I met a man who didn't like him. There were brothers who loved Salman. There were fathers who preferred Amitabh Bachchan. And it's interesting, right? These exact different tropes of the masculine, these stoic, quiet, strong men, and all of that. But I also felt with him, I think a lot of men felt very, I've always joked that I think he's made South Asian men of a certain type feel deeply inadequate since the 1990s. And I think that's because he's playing all these scripts and idioms that women so desperately want. Like, as I'm saying, the seeking, it's not Shah Rukh, it's this kind of masculine, which is missing in their lives. And I noticed that that made men grumble. It made them uncomfortable. I did meet some straight male fans of Mr. Khan's, but they tended to be fans much more from the perspective of his success. And at the end of the book, I'm standing outside Mannat. I used to stand outside Mannat and interview fans who'd show up just because I wanted to know what was the profile, who are these people, like why are they coming there? And I used to go for his birthday celebrations, which is this mad thing. And what was interesting was that, and the last section of the book, it's called Madness at Mannat, because actually, although women are a significantly larger share of his fan base, when you go to that birthday celebration, it's a wall of men. And I was talking to a gentleman who sells water there because it's a tourist spot. And he said to me, well, women won't come because it's too large, public space is difficult. And there was a case of mob molestation outside Mannat. 2 women reported it, and it's unsafe for women, even in Bombay. On bandstand. This is the society we live in terms of public space. And so while there are men who are fans of his, I notice a lot of it tends to be about his success. It's a different kind of love, and I really haven't investigated it, the male fan base. But the female fan base I followed, I noticed the men in the families were very uncomfortable. So that's something I do think we have to acknowledge, and it's interesting what's going on. I think there is some kind of recognition of this alternate masculine ideal and feeling anxious about that, right? Because men have also been raised to believe and socialized to believe that you should be, like the stoic breadwinner, and he's departing from that. I think on your question about whether that actually means there are renegotiations in their real lives about domestic labor, what's fascinating to me is I followed these women for more than a decade. And each one of them, on the surface, you wouldn't think that they were doing anything radical. They're just trying to earn their own money, and they want to have a job, and they want to have their own fun. They just want to live life. But one of the things that I realized through the research of this book is that it's so difficult for women to just do something as simple as that. Because where will you find a house to live on your own? Where will you find this job which will, and after motherhood, it's difficult to return back to work, especially if you work in like the private sector or even in the informal economy for poor women. Um, and what was fascinating to me was that each one of these women, though, has been able to renegotiate a different equilibrium in her own life. And I won't give it away, you'll have to read the book to know. I can give you one example. I mean, just being single past the age of like 38, 35, rejecting the notion of marriage. And this one woman said to me, she said, I'm not going to marry, my standards are as high as Shah Rukh. And she doesn't mean it in this foolish way that, oh, I want him. But what she's saying is that I want a man who will actually support my ambitions. And it's very hard to find. When you read the book, you'll have a sense of what that landscape is like. But I think to answer your question, yes, there are renegotiations. But they're very different in different stories, different places based on class and caste and occupation. And you should read the book to see what happens through 15 years. Thanks.
This is completely anecdotal, but even in a fairly privileged demographic group where we belong, he causes discomfort amongst traditional men. Yeah. Deep discomfort, if I may say so. And I mean, as compared to, say, even at Salman and an Amir, who are that generation. So this I have noticed with some interest and curiosity, but it does happen. They have somebody else has a question. Lady at the back first, and then you can.
Someone else. Am I audible? Okay. You can just. Okay. Am I audible?
Pull the mask down.
Okay. 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 First of all, I love your book so much. It's so good and it's so nuanced. I feel. My question is not directly related to the discussion here, but the book is so nuanced. I feel so many people have missed the nuances. I feel even I have to reread it to get everything that you've been saying. And also, I also feel that you also came across some of these nuances while writing the book over 15 years or something. So my question is, I've seen responses to your book be like, especially on, for example, Twitter, be like, the SRK fans and the SRK parts are not as important, or they are trite in comparison to like all the stuff you're talking about women and their access to space, how they're negotiating their daily lives, etc. And it's so nuanced because, as you've said, it's about women co-creating SRK in like through their own perspectives than SRK himself. So we can't essentialize SRK, right? You've been saying this throughout the book, but like the response to your book, I feel either, okay, this is very stupid way of saying it, but they've either gotten it or they haven't gotten it, right? So like they haven't gotten the nuance. So like my question is, how would you, what is your take on that? Because it's so dumb to me, because you keep talking throughout the book about how we are not talking about SRK as like, as you mentioned, this monolithic unit of like, I don't know, perfection of all accounts, but like how women are according him that perfection in their lives. So yeah, that's my question.
That's such a great question. Thank you. You know, we live in a culture where I think we're much more comfortable just dismissing women's voices. So especially when women are saying things like, well, this is the kind of man I think is ideal, the easiest thing to just do is just say, that's just silly. I do recognize that people who are not fans of his, there are parts of the book that are difficult for them to perhaps access. And that's okay. I mean, as I mentioned to Parma in the beginning, you can't expect, I've retired this idea that people will read it exactly the way I want them to read it. People will read it the way they want to, and I think that's great. People should read it exactly the way they like. If they pick up the subtlety and what's going on, that's fine. I do notice, it is a fact, it's very gendered. I've noticed that straight women and gay men, for some reason, seem to just I can almost now, and I'm sorry, but I actually have to categorize it. That's actually the two groups that have really just immediately picked up the book, and it's, you know, the responses are, they almost seem to, it really resonates, I think, with their experience. And then there are people who may not, because they've just never seen it that way, and then they look at the data, or they look at the theory, and that's fine. I think that's wonderful, actually. I think people should read it differently. You can't hit people on the head with sort of, you know, this is the way to see it. But I do think we are very comfortable deifying men. We love men so much. That is our culture. You know, this is like we just want them to be on a pedestal. And the idea that actually the book is not about this man being on the pedestal, but actually these women and why they place him, they give him so much love. You know, today in the morning I was talking to someone, there's a big difference between love and worship. And I think we live in a culture which worships men and just does not recognize that actually worship may not involve love. You may not actually have affect towards this ritual of worship. And I think these women in my book, they love themselves. And one way of loving themselves is to want to watch an actor. They find pleasure in watching. And then they place him on a pedestal. It's not about him being on a pedestal. But thank you for that question.
I mean, it's also a question of liking him, I think. You know, that's very important, as distinct from worship or even romantic love. I think Shah Rukh straddles that space very, very well. Anyway, you had a question.
So, hi, I don't know if my question is exactly related to economics, but I wanted to say this. I wanted to know your views on Shah Rukh's idea and how the way his performances portray romance. And since we are talking about a male fandom and the differences, so I think his idea of romance, like his dynamic with the heroine in most films, are a little different from his contemporaries, because in most cases, the woman in Bollywood films of Shah Rukh Khan has a part to play. I will give an example of Kabhi Haan Kabhi Na, where he continues.
My favorite film of his.
He continues to get rejected by the girl, and even then he just behaves normally. And like we are actually, the fact that I'm actually saying this is credit, this is supposed to be normal.
Yeah,
we are actually giving
exactly,
credit
that's so
here.
true.
And I wanted to know your views on his idea of this romance, and if this has in any way contributed to the female fandom, like, you know, this female following he has, his idea of romance, even in Kal Ho Na Ho. And in films like this, his idea and his difference, that's why Shah Rukh Khan is always associated with romance rather than masculinity, because romance has a sort of softness associated with it. Because in films like in Amir and Salman's films, at least Amir's earlier films, I mean, there's an idea of action, where Shah Rukh's romantic films are always very relegated to the relationship with the heterosexual relationship.
Yeah.
So about that,
I'll just tag a rider. It's also his comfort with strong women. You know, say Alia in Hello Zindagi, or whatever it was called. She's strong in her own way.
Okay.
Or a Kali Billi of Priyanka.
Yeah, okay. So
just
firstly, I have to say, I am not a Shah Rukh Khan expert. And I'm not going to speak on his view. There are many questions we should just ask him. And please, Parama, get Byju's to host a conversation between us. And then all these questions, I promise I will channel. And I know he'll talk about the economy as well.
Thought.
Yes, he does. Yes, thank you. And now that Parama is here, I'm going to make sure I'll put enough pressure this way also, but thank you. But you know, I want to tell you something. I think your question's actually very relevant for for a couple of reasons. One is, I actually discuss in the book that, you know, Salman's masculinity is stoic masculine. Amir's masculinity is productive professional. Shah Rukh is like the anxious, vulnerable one. All the films have him playing someone who's very conscious of the gaze of the other. He could be playing a robot, he could be playing a criminal, he could be playing a lover boy, it doesn't matter. All the scenes have this part where he's very conscious of the way other people, particularly women, are seeing him. If you see the others, the gaze is not, they're just so confident in who they are that they are not bothered, which is a very unreal person actually, but forget that. And I think that's why women or anyone who's felt attacked by an external gaze feels very comfortable, because here's a person who's trying these tears. So I think that's part of it. I don't think it's so much just the idiom of romance, and we should say these are written by other people. It's not just him, right? Like these are co-created products, right? But the other thing which is interesting is, remember, we live in a country where only 5% of women choose their own husbands. That's the landscape of marriage and dating in our country. So given that, these are films that celebrate romantic autonomy, because here men and women choose each other. They're entering into like this mating market, if you were. Right? It's a new market, and I think it's getting even more and more mature with dating apps and so on and so forth. that idea of romantic choice, which actually is accorded to so few people, and there are stories in the book you'll see, like there's a young woman, her entire generation, her family, women have just been married based on, it's almost like a business deal. She decides she's not going to participate in that business deal. She wants to marry for love. And that idea of love has come very much, it's been concretized. These are women who aren't reading novels necessarily or interacting a lot with Western media. So Hindi film has a very strong psychological imprint on them in the way they understand that. And I think that 90s phase and even the early 2000s has been really important. So I think it has a lot to do with the lack of romantic autonomy that we accord women in our culture as well. And I think they speak to that.
I think we now do have to wind this up. Thank you, Shravana, for writing such a lovely book and the lovely discussion and being such an enthusiastic audience. And here's to both financial emancipation and romantic autonomy.
Thank you to both the lovely ladies and the lovely discussion. We now move on to our next session, which is titled Amish at Large, where Amish Tripathi will talk about writing the pandemic and seeing India from outside and within. He'll be in conversation with Janet Gaspar Chaudhary.